Imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a battlefield, not one drawn in blood and mud, but in thought, will, and the soul's silent wars. Around you, the ruins of once great civilizations crumble under the weight of their own morality. The air tastes of compromise. Every voice you hear pleads for safety, comfort, and the illusion of goodness. But then, in the distance, you see a figure walking calmly through the wreckage, aloof, unbent, unrepentant. He doesn't stop to weep for the fallen, nor does he kneel at the altars of guilt or pity. His gaze is sharp, like he's peering through the mass of the world. This man is Friedrich Nietzsche, and he whispers something that cuts deeper than any sword. I hate the weak. But what does that mean? It sounds cruel, maybe even inhuman. We've been told to protect the vulnerable, to uplift the struggling, to soften ourselves in the name of compassion. But Nietzsche's words are a slap in the face to that narrative. They awaken something uncomfortable within you, something ancient and primal. Is he talking about the physically weak, the sick, the poor, or something else entirely? Something buried deep in the psyche? You start to wonder, what if weakness isn't about frailty of body, but a corruption of spirit? What if the people you consider nice are actually dangerous because they lack the will to confront darkness? What if your own kindness is a mask you wear to avoid conflict, growth, or truth? These aren't questions the modern world likes to ask. We have turned suffering into virtue, victimhood into identity, and mediocrity into comfort. We elevate fragility as though it were sacred. We treat challenge as trauma. We build systems to protect the timid from the trials that make a soul strong. But Nietzsche saw through this charade. To him, the real disease wasn't pain, it was avoidance. It was the collective effort to eliminate all forms of struggle, hardship, and intensity from life. And in doing so, we began to rot from the inside out. Our ethics became diluted. Our art lost its fire. Our minds became tame, compliant, sedated. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you admired someone because they were truly good or because they were truly powerful? Are you more drawn to the comfort of affirmation or the friction of truth? Would you rather be accepted or transformed? Nietzsche wasn't heartless. His contempt for the weak wasn't rooted in arrogance, but in alarm. He saw the creeping spread of spiritual inertia, the kind that feeds on safety and turns people into shadows of what they could be. He believed that beneath the surface of our pleasantries, most people secretly hate the strong. Not because they're cruel, but because they remind us of our own refusal to rise. What Nietzsche despised wasn't misfortune. He didn't scoff at the poor, the ill, or the struggling. What he hated was self-pity turned into philosophy, victimhood weaponized as virtue, the refusal to evolve, the surrender of will, the celebration of smallness as though it were holiness, and perhaps the most damning insight of all. He saw this weakness not as something imposed upon people, but something they chose. He called it slave morality, the ethic of the envious, the meek, and the bitter. A system of values created not by the noble or the courageous, but by those who needed to justify their inability to rise. In this system, humility replaced courage, obedience replaced independence, pity replaced power. So now the question echoes louder. Is weakness really something to pity, or is it something to overcome? And if Nietzsche was right, have we built an entire culture on a lie? You begin to feel the tremor under your feet, not from fear, but from the realization that something enormous is shifting, something inside you, something that was waiting to be questioned, something ancient, something wild. This isn't just a philosophical thought experiment, it's personal. Because if Nietzsche's warning is true, then the very things you admire, niceness, humility, safety, might be the very chains that keep you from becoming who you're meant to be. So before you reject his words in outrage, ask yourself one final question. What if Nietzsche didn't hate weak people because he was cruel, but because he wanted them to rise? Let's go deeper. You've stepped past the threshold now. The words have disturbed something. Perhaps a quiet part of you, long silenced, has begun to murmur. You feel it in your chest, a defiant pulse, but it's not rage. It's recognition. You've seen this weakness before, not just in others, but in yourself. In the moments you didn't speak when you should have, in the quiet withdrawal when you feared judgment, in the way you've dulled your own desires to fit into the fragile skin of acceptance. But where did this weakness come from? And why did Nietzsche see it as such a threat? To answer that, we need to go deeper, beyond morality, beyond culture, into the labyrinth of the psyche itself. The hidden problem isn't weakness, it's worshiping weakness. Nietzsche's critique was radical because it wasn't aimed at individuals. It was aimed at an entire value system, a value system born not of strength, but of resentment. He called it ressentiment, a deep, poisonous form of envy that the powerless feel toward the powerful. But rather than transforming this envy into ambition, ressentiment turns it into ideology. It flips the moral compass upside down. Suddenly, the strong are no longer admirable, they are evil. The bold are no longer inspiring, they are arrogant. The independent are no longer free, they are selfish. In the eyes of slave morality, anyone who dares to rise above the herd becomes a threat to be diminished, not a model to be emulated. This inversion of values, Nietzsche claimed, was the great tragedy of Western civilization. To understand how it happened, you must look to the roots of Judeo-Christian morality. While Nietzsche had respect for many aspects of Christianity, he saw in it a dangerous impulse: the elevation of suffering into sainthood, the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, that turning the other cheek is a moral victory, that the broken are closer to God. He saw this not as divine truth, but as a brilliant and dangerous survival strategy, a spiritual revenge by the weak against the strong, a moral system designed not to elevate humanity, but to tame it. Carl Jung would later echo this concern in his own way. He spoke of the shadow, the dark, unconscious parts of ourselves that we repress. In a society obsessed with niceness, compliance, and meekness, the shadow becomes monstrous. The more we deny our aggression, our pride, our desire to dominate, the more they twist into pathological forms. We don't become angels. We become hypocrites, smiling devils wearing the robes of saints. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Nietzsche would agree. To him, confronting this inner darkness was the path to Übermensch, the higher man, the one who creates his own values beyond good and evil. But to get there, you must abandon the comfortable myths of victimhood and face the terrifying truth. You are responsible for your own becoming. But responsibility is heavy. It's easier to call the strong oppressors than to become strong yourself. It's easier to say the world is unfair than to dare to transcend it. And so, society reinforces your fragility. It tells you that your wounds are who you are, that your anxiety is your personality, that your trauma is your truth. It hands you a moral blanket and whispers, you don't need to change. You just need to be validated. But validation is not transformation. And Nietzsche wasn't interested in soothing you. He wanted to wake you up. Now think of Gabor Mate's work on addiction. He doesn't speak in Nietzsche's harsh tones, but he uncovers a similar wound. To Mate, addiction is not about drugs or substances. It's about the emotional pain we cannot face. And often that pain is rooted in disempowerment, in childhoods where boundaries were violated, in lives where autonomy was stripped, in cultures where personal will is buried under compliance. Mate sees a society addicted not just to chemicals, but to distraction, consumption, avoidance, a society running from itself. In Nietzsche's eyes, this is precisely what happens when slave morality becomes dominant. People stop striving and start numbing. They worship their scars instead of healing them. They look to the system for protection instead of looking inward for strength. So now the hidden problem is clearer. Weakness isn't a flaw, it's a seduction, a trap that feels like virtue. We are conditioned to avoid confrontation, to fear judgment, to equate obedience with goodness. Schools reward memorization over courage. Workplaces reward conformity over innovation. And the media floods us with narratives where the most broken character is the most morally pure. But Nietzsche didn't believe in purity. He believed in transformation, in becoming. In the sacred fire of the will to power, not to dominate others, but to master oneself. Now step outside your own mind for a moment. Imagine your world through Nietzsche's eyes, not as it claims to be, but as it is. A civilization not ascending toward truth and greatness, but sinking into comfort, conformity, and cowardice, while praising itself for its progress. The very idea of ambition is met with suspicion. Excellence is mocked as elitism. Passion, if it disrupts consensus, is labeled dangerous. And mediocrity, it becomes the warm blanket under which the modern soul lies paralyzed, cradled by a system that feeds it empty praise for staying small. This is not hyperbole. It is the quiet, systemic consequence of elevating weakness to a virtue. Nietzsche saw this inversion of values not as an abstract theory, but as a slow-acting spiritual poison. A poison that numbs the will, not all at once, not with fire or swords, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. Every time you're told to tone it down, every time your instincts are pathologized as toxic, every time the system hands you a trophy not for victory, but for showing up and obeying the rules. You may not feel it immediately, but over time, the result is devastating. You stop wanting to become powerful, not because it's impossible, but because it's been rebranded as evil. Think about it. How often have you witnessed this cultural sleight of hand, where those who build empires are accused of greed, while those who build excuses are labeled relatable? Where beauty is scorned as shallow, intelligence is shamed as privilege, and strength is seen as a threat, unless it's been softened, guilt-ridden, and drenched in apology? Nietzsche would argue, this is not compassion, this is decay. But how did this happen? Modern neuroscience might hold a clue. Research into cognitive bias reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth. We don't crave truth, we crave comfort. Our brains are wired to avoid pain, to minimize cognitive dissonance, to reinforce what we already believe. And when morality becomes a tool for avoiding discomfort, rather than facing reality, you don't get virtue, you get mass delusion. In that delusion, weakness isn't seen as something to be overcome, it's something to be celebrated. Take the rise of safe spaces, a term meant to protect, but often used to shield people from any idea that might challenge their worldview. What begins as protection quickly becomes insulation. Minds are no longer sharpened, they're padded, and fragility is no longer seen as a wound, it becomes an identity. The consequence? Growth becomes impossible. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that man is condemned to be free, that with consciousness comes a terrifying responsibility. You are what you choose to become. There is no cosmic parent coming to save you, no divine checklist that grants meaning. Meaning must be forged, alone, in the crucible of struggle. But in a culture where struggle is avoided at all costs, freedom becomes a burden. So we surrender it. We trade our autonomy for validation, our fire for comfort, our power for the illusion of safety. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He didn't hate the weak. He hated the worship of weakness, the elevation of self-pity over self-overcoming. And that worship has consequences. You begin to see it in education systems that no longer challenge students to master knowledge, but instead lower the bar to avoid stress. In therapy models that shift from healing the wound to accommodating the scar. In political movements that gain traction not through merit or vision, but by weaponizing victimhood, by shouting louder about who has suffered more, who has been hurt deeper, who deserves protection the most. In this race to the bottom, Nietzsche's voice becomes a scream against the tide. He who cannot command himself must obey, and many are born to serve. That sounds cruel until you see it unfold in real time. People surrender their critical thinking to algorithms, their opinions to influencers, their ambitions to employers who trade freedom for routine, and worst of all, they surrender their identity to ideologies that promise validation without transformation. This is not compassion, this is spiritual sedation. Even Viktor Frankl, who endured the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, warned of this danger. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, he spoke of the existential vacuum, a spiritual emptiness born not of trauma, but of a life without purpose. And what fills that vacuum? Distraction, consumption, herd morality. In such a world, Nietzsche's critique becomes urgent, not theoretical, because the worship of weakness has real, measurable effects. Depression skyrockets, not because life is harder, but because meaning is absent. Anxiety spreads, not because danger is everywhere, but because resilience is rare. Narcissism rises, not out of self-love, but because in a world where everyone is fragile, any assertion of strength feels revolutionary. It's not just individuals who suffer, it's civilizations. Imagine a society where no one strives beyond the mediocre, where no one speaks truth because truth might offend, where leadership is neutered, art is sterilized, and boldness is pathologized. This is not dystopian fiction. It's visible in every sphere: education, art, media, politics. It's the slow rot of a culture that confuses kindness with submission and strength with tyranny. And yet this rot is covered in the language of virtue. That's what makes it so dangerous. The weak do not present themselves as conquerors, but as victims. And in a society obsessed with avoiding offense, the victim becomes untouchable, immune to critique, above examination. And so weakness gains not just sympathy, but power. A power Nietzsche feared most, the power to define morality itself. He called Christianity a slave revolt in morality, not because it was evil, but because it inverted the natural order. Instead of admiring the lion, it sanctified the lamb. Instead of aspiring to greatness, it canonized humility. And while humility has its place, when it becomes the highest virtue, the desire to rise is treated as sin. And so the lion forgets he has claws. He lies down beside the lamb, and together they starve. That is the ultimate consequence of a world built on weakness. Not just personal failure, but collective collapse. But you are not meant to collapse. The pulse you felt at the beginning, that echo of defiance, it hasn't left. It grows louder now. Because within you, Nietzsche believed, is something ancient and sacred. A will that refuses to be tamed. A self not yet born, but burning to emerge. But first you must rebel. You must tear away the veil. You must walk through fire. You must choose strength, not because it's easy, but because everything you've been taught tells you not to. The next section will reveal how to break the spell, how to rise above the herd, how to become terrifyingly, gloriously free. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff. Beneath you, the familiar world of comfort, moral simplicity, and mediocrity. Behind you, the voices of society call out, pleading, "Come back, don't jump, it's dangerous to go alone." But ahead, beyond that terrifying leap, is the unknown. A realm without excuses, without crutches, without handrails. It is the place Nietzsche called the domain of the Übermensch, the overman, the beyond man. Not a perfect being, but one who dares to recreate value itself. One who chooses meaning without needing permission. And if you're brave enough to leap, to leave behind the herd, to unlearn the morality of weakness, then you begin the rebellion. But this is not rebellion for its own sake. This is not punk rock defiance or adolescent rage. This is spiritual war, not against others, but against everything in you that has been trained to obey. So how do you begin? First, you must kill your inner slave. That part of you that waits to be told what is good. That part that seeks the approval of the masses, or worse, the pity of those more successful. That part of you that whispers, "It's not your fault. Stay small. Stay safe." Nietzsche's rebellion begins by silencing that voice, not through violence, but through confrontation. Look it in the eye and say, "I no longer need to be coddled. I no longer need to be understood. I no longer need to be liked. What I need is to become powerful." But power here is not domination over others. It is domination over yourself. The will to shape your instincts, refine your desires, and carve your identity from the raw stone of chaos. Nietzsche called it the will to power, but most people misunderstand that phrase. They think it means tyranny, conquest, aggression. But in Nietzsche's world, the will to power is the creative force. It is the internal flame that says, "I will not inherit meaning, I will forge it. I will create values rather than borrow them. I will become my own God, my own judge, my own law. Sound extreme? It should, because mediocrity dies hard. Society does not want you to break free. Your comfort zone will not go quietly. The moment you rebel, really rebel, you will become terrifying to those around you. Not because you are cruel, but because you expose what they have buried, the truth of their own inaction. Rebellion, then, is not a group activity. It begins in solitude. Carl Jung understood this. He warned that most people never individuate. That is, they never become whole. Instead, they settle into collective norms, hiding behind roles, expectations, and borrowed identities. To individuate is to confront your shadow, to face your own chaos, your rage, your lust, your hunger for dominance and transcendence. And instead of suppressing it, integrate it. The weak suppress their chaos and call it virtue. The strong confront it and call it truth. So you must stop playing the victim in your own story. Stop outsourcing your pain to the past. Stop waiting for redemption to come from without. You will never be rescued. And that is good news, because it means you are the rescuer. To rebel is to create a new hierarchy, one where you answer to yourself and yourself alone. Not to ideology, not to your trauma, not to the ghost of your upbringing. The only God Nietzsche wanted you to serve was the one you could become. This doesn't mean selfishness. It doesn't mean cruelty. But it does mean radical self-responsibility. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow and decide that no one owes you anything. Not love, not fairness, not understanding. You owe yourself everything. Your pain is yours. Your potential is yours. Your weakness is yours. And so is your strength. That terrifying freedom, that's your rebellion. And now you're dangerous, not to others, but to lies, to apathy, to the systems built on making you forget who you are. Historical examples whisper to us from the depths. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, not to destroy the world, but to ignite it. Jesus, not the soft figure of children's books, but the rebel who overturned tables and temples and dared to claim that the kingdom of God was within you. Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who spoke to angels and defied kings. Malcolm X, who shattered the victim narrative with words like thunder. Viktor Frankl, who found meaning in a concentration camp and emerged stronger. All of them knew the secret. Rebellion is not destruction. It is creation born from refusal. Refusal to be less than what you could become. Refusal to bow to fear. Refusal to kneel before false gods of comfort, validation, and herd morality. To break free is to suffer, but it is sacred suffering, not the passive ache of regret, but the active burn of transformation. Yes, you will be misunderstood. Yes, you will be exiled from polite company. Yes, your old self will beg you to stop. Now imagine this. You've walked through the inferno of doubt. You've stared into the abyss and did not blink. You have torn off the mask you wore for love, for acceptance, for safety. You stood naked before your own inner wilderness and emerged reborn. Your rebellion has scorched away the falsehoods. But what now? What remains after the fire? What is left after you have broken all chains, rejected all hand-me-down virtues, and silenced the inner voice that begged you to stay small? You expected triumph, power, invincibility. And yet, standing on the other side of weakness, what greets you is something stranger, quieter, stillness, not silence, not absence, but a presence so vast, so ancient, so humbling it takes your breath away. This is the secret Nietzsche never said aloud, the truth he dared only to circle like a hawk, never to cage in simple words. You see, Nietzsche did not hate weakness because it made people suffer. He hated it because it made people lie. He hated the mask of virtue weakness wore, the pretense, the pity paraded as love, the obedience cloaked as goodness, the fear that disguised itself as humility. He wanted you to kill the lie, not the person, not the suffering, but the illusion that shackled you to the herd. Because beneath all that, there is a truth that weakness cannot reach, not because it's evil, but because it's too fragile. And what is that truth? It is love, but not the kind you think, not the sentimental kind, not the comforting embrace that shields you from the storm, but a fierce, holy love that demands you become more than you are. A love that says, I will not rescue you. I will not coddle you. I will not protect you from yourself. But I will believe in your capacity to rise. This is love that cuts. This is love that burns. This is love that says, if I did not love you, I would let you stay asleep. But because I do, I will tear your illusions apart until all that's left is you, undivided. And here is the final paradox. Nietzsche, the philosopher of fire, was not a preacher of hate. He was a prophet of transformation. He didn't hate weak people because he wanted to oppress them. He hated the system that encouraged them to remain weak, then told them they were righteous for it. He hated what weakness did to the human soul when it was worshipped instead of overcome. He saw in each of us a spark, a seed of the Übermensch. But like a cruel parent spoiling their child, society taught us not to grow, but to obey, not to rise, but to kneel. Nietzsche screamed through his books like a madman, not because he was filled with rage, but because he was filled with grief. He watched the potential of millions die silently, day after day, not from disease, not from war, but from the quiet death of never becoming who they could have been. And here is where the truth becomes unbearable. The weak, if they remain weak by choice, if they refuse the call to grow, to change, to suffer meaningfully, they become dangerous, not to others, but to themselves. Because eventually their resentment turns toxic. They hate the strong not because they are evil, but because they are a reminder of what they chose not to become. And resentment, Nietzsche said, is the poison of the soul. The moment you envy, the moment you curse others for your own chains, you fall into what he called slave morality. A morality of inversion, where power becomes evil and impotence becomes holiness. But, and this is the shocking twist, Nietzsche never said the weak must be discarded. He said they must be invited to overcome. He didn't write for the already powerful. He wrote for you, the person broken by life, the person who has suffered betrayal, poverty, heartbreak, loneliness. But the one who still, despite it all, hears a whisper in the night. You were made for more. And now that whisper becomes a roar. Because now you know, the rebellion was never about domination. It was about liberation. And the truth? The truth is this. You do not overcome weakness by destroying it. You overcome it by integrating it. You look at the trembling child within you, the one who was scared, the one who cried for safety, and you say, I see you. But we cannot stay here. You are part of me, but you are not all of me. You rise not by pretending you are fearless, but by refusing to be ruled by fear. You become strong not by crushing others, but by confronting your own cowardice with compassion and resolve. The ultimate realization is not power without love. It is love that empowers. It is strength that heals. It is courage that creates, not just a better world, but a better self. Nietzsche wanted you to become a creator of values, not a destroyer of hearts. But to do that, you must pass through the fire, through rebellion, through exile, through solitude, until finally you emerge, whole, not perfect, but authentic, not adored, but awake. And now you see what Nietzsche saw.